Welcome to Mentor Time. Today we're going to talk about the references that you need for a job, or actually for anything. Promotions, fellowships, getting awards sometimes are required. Who you should ask and traps to avoid. And I actually talked about them more positively in terms of what you need to do so you don't get into traps. Here's what we're going to cover today. What do job references in 2024 look like compared to what we've done for decades in the past? Then we'll talk about when giving references, the timing of it is really changing a lot and has changed. And as always, we end with what should you do? Before I turn to the takeaway for today, I'd appreciate knowing in the chat if any of you have had to give references recently in the past 2 years, and if you don't mind sharing with me, did they ask for them when you applied? Did they ask for them before an interview, after an interview, or after a job offer? If you just want to say yes or no, you can say yes is a 1, 0 is a no. You haven't used the references in the last 2 years. If you have, let me know the timing immediately. Before an interview, after an interview, or after a job offer?
You're getting asked for when they're scheduled and or during the interview. And so I've talked to a lot of colleagues and there's frustration over that because then they're telling the people that they're asking to me references. They would prefer for it to be when they're making the final decision. Hey, can you send me references? But they're not. They're asking for it at the time they schedule the interview or during the interview.
Before they schedule the interview?
When they do the interview, they'll say, please go ahead and send references.
Sheila said before and after job offer. Let's think about what it means to be doing references now. No spoiler alert if you've been in the job market or working with people who are. We're getting pressure at various stages. It used to be you never gave references until after a job offer was in your hands, informally by word, verbally, or maybe even in writing. Now people are getting asked for them at time of application, before an interview, the first interview, after an interview, and then the traditional when you get a job offer. The takeaway for today, and thanks to everybody who was able to respond, is references are not just the other person's work. So if you're asking for a reference from me, it's not all my work. In fact, you all probably have heard me say at least once, don't make me do your work for you. So let's start with where are we in 2024 for job references? Sokna said recently she had to provide references for 2 jobs after the interview process. Okay, that's good to know. There's still no consensus. So you all are seeing the kinds of up in the air situation we seem to be in. Here's what I hear from many of you who contact me. Referees aren't timely, even when I remind them of deadlines, and that must be so frustrating for you all. We'll talk about ways you can make it easier on yourself. There are some of you who said, I don't have referees who've worked with me recently for a variety of reasons. They're not available or it's not applicable, and that frustrates you. And mentees and learners have also said, some of you, I don't want them to contact my previous employer. And that makes everybody's heart beat fast because it's not just what you know happened or what you feel happened, it's also the employer. So I want to start there. I want to start with what can the previous employer, the employer you're leaving or have left, say about you? And I will tell you that everything that I looked at, these advice situations resonate in both the US and Canada. In fact, someone from Canada said just because there's a border dividing line doesn't mean that we aren't very careful about references. So this was an article by a law firm, and I pasted the way it was written in a screenshot way below. But he emphasized that they should only be answering in two parts. The first is purely about job performance and nothing else. The second one surprised me and said the person providing the reference can do anything they want. I'm embroidering. As long as it's true, that's good. I'm glad it has to be true. Or an honestly held opinion. Oops, I forgot to change the screen, so I'd like to show you. So the second part of it is you can say anything you want as long as it's true or an honestly held opinion. Welcome, Priyanka. We just got started. So I'm talking right now about what can my previous employer say about me? And I realized that in this case, the word opinion maybe misleads us a little bit. But in my mind, what he's saying is an honestly held opinion is not supposition. So here's the difference. Your boss might say about this about you because he can readily evaluate you for the kind of work he hired you to do. He could say, Sue was unable to do the job. He knows me. He's coming from a context of what I can provide. HR or someone from another department might say something like, I don't think he had the skills to do the job, whoever he is. And to me, that is supposition. That is not an opinion. The supposition is not informed by anything other than what the person wants to believe or had experience with, just generally finding out. There's no clear answer to this, but we'll in a few minutes, we'll talk about a couple US state examples, and you'll see more clearly what you are and aren't allowed to say. I wanted to share this. It's a 2-page comment that was made in Quora when someone asked if you had to share everything. And I bolded in red what I thought he was really great. A little bit too frank. This is like Quora. Quora is a place to get answers and help. Quora frank talk, you'd want to soften it, but he's also given you sample scripts. So the first thing is tell the truth. So if you didn't like your old boss because of the way you couldn't get work done, then say that, no matter whether it's got fired or whatever. Don't try to cover something up because you're going to be found out for in whatever reason. And he goes through, I could check your reference and find out I know the guy you worked for and whatever. But what he said is, after you talk about I messed up on the job and got fired, or my boss and I couldn't agree and I had to leave even though it was only 3 months, he said immediately, if you can, and this implies you're talking to someone in person or in a synchronous way, that you could give counter references of other jobs. And in fact, in the third section on what should you do, I'll show you one way to handle it. I thought it was interesting in the yellow, he said, I would consider hiring someone who leveled with me on a reference that was bad, but they gave me the reference information. And I was surprised in red. The display of honesty is rare. And I'm thinking, I don't know who you interview. I wouldn't expect that. But he has some very interesting points. And we're always looking for sample scripts. So hopefully that will help some of you if you're in this situation. An article on can an employer disclose that you were fired has a lot of different parts to it. So I've taken these parts out to show you. On the right is the TLDR takeaways. Too long, didn't read takeaways for the whole article. But the first thing is that, and this is experience that I had over 10 years ago, our HR department and many organizations' policies are only HR gives the reference. And in this case, in yellow, they provide or they validate the dates of employment that said Sue left your company in July 2014. Is that true? Yes. It said Sue said she was a VP of the evaluation center. Was that true? Yes. You notice salary isn't in there. That's getting to be a very touchy point in the US. You're not allowed to ask about salary even now to verify it. Used to be company references would call up the HR of the place you left to validate that indeed you did make $52,000 a year, and now you want a salary of 62 or whatever. This is really great advice. Before you make a move, and just generally, you should know what your company's handbook says. And the handbook is full of policies. And one is usually on something like, here's what you as an employee are entitled to if there's a separation, information, benefits, whatever. What I thought was interesting that we should all think about is, this said if you don't have an exit interview, but in the yellow, and maybe this is something that we do proactively to be aware of it, is ask your manager or HR, what information does the company give out when they're asked to verify your work history? Now, that may signal to HR or your boss that you're looking for a job, but you also can ask about it generally in terms of the larger context. For example, I regularly attend a professional development seminar, and they said we should check with company policies on all sorts of things, including what kinds of employee information is disclosed if someone's asking about, for example, the work that I do here. And finally, check state laws. And I'm sure Canada and provinces have this as well. I wouldn't be surprised if Europe does also. I didn't find much online about Europe, not anything. But each state limits generally what you can say. And I chose 2 states because they're states I know from other work I've done. Maryland, where I live and where I worked, and then Virginia, which is not far away, and many of us work together. They're very different states. Maryland's labor laws are such that they're called an at-will state. So they hire you at will. You don't need a contract, although most of us have some kind of contract. And you can be fired at will. In actual fact, you do need to go through a grievance and improvement 3 months before a company could fire you unless there's cause, unless there's lying, embezzling, stealing, something like that. But here's what Maryland says, not whether or not they can talk about you, but that they can't be held liable for disclosing information about the performance or the reason you were terminated if they stick to facts. Now, notice under the yellow on the left-hand margin that says they can even include information that isn't technically true as long as it's not defamatory. If you defame someone, that's a legal action. I was surprised about that because we just heard from Mr. Barada that you shouldn't lie. You can state your opinion. Virginia, on the other hand, and both of these were AI generated by Google, so that's why I gave you the link to it rather than going through 3 or 4 articles. Google summarized Virginia in a very different way, and so I don't know if this is actually codified in Virginia law this way. But it says that the labor laws in Virginia, which is not an at-will state, and when I looked at it for salary disclosure information a couple of years ago, what Virginia is considered has a very favorable to employer environment for industries, meaning employers win over employees, was how I read it. But it says here, under written request, if someone wants a reference, they can only do it if they request it in writing and with written permission from me or you, the former employee. I was shocked at that. I wonder how many people get frustrated trying to get an employee to release information. I hope to see some friends that live and work in Virginia and see if I can find out more. So you can see just 2 states out of the US's 50 states are very different. And before we leave this, don't forget that references are not just who you designate or who HR calls up. There's informal channels. These are back channels. Maybe I know Stephanie and I call her up and say, Stephanie, I heard so-and-so leaving CDC. I know CDC is huge. Do you know anything about it? Or someone might call me and say, Sue, I can't believe you hired so-and-so. If you'd only checked with me, I would have told you whatever. So there's always that. You can't prevent everything. But what you can do is take control of the conversation, and I'm going to show you some of that in a few minutes. Let's go on to the second part of this, which is when you are asked as a job seeker to give your list of references, that timing is changing. Here's one of the first things I found. From a year ago, this person writing the Harvard.com blog said, it's a good sign if references are being checked. It means that you're probably going to receive an offer of employment. I'm here to tell you that stuff was out of date even a year ago, but it's definitely out of date now. And this is a Google search for questions like, at what point do you do reference checks? At what point in the job searching, I tried to be as precise as possible, are companies asking for these? So I selected a few. Yale University says after you've interviewed all candidates and selected your final one, that's been what in the past it always was. In the middle on the left-hand side, US News and World Report says towards the end of the hiring process or right before you make an offer. And then the next one, Cross HQ, actually had pros and cons for before the interview or after the interview. And finally, a cast said final stage of recruitment. And lo and behold, an article that was written in the last month still had incorrect information saying, you don't need to provide them, don't worry about them, but it's a good idea to have them ready to go before you land an interview. I'm here to tell you that they are probably requesting them more and more at the time that you apply, because they're using those not just to check and give you a chance to be able to determine if you're going to be a stellar employee, but they're also going to do it to whittle down the effort that they have to make interviewing people. Many companies require you to have 3 final candidates, and they want you to have 3 interviews, but I believe there are ways that people are not even doing that anymore. So this is a version of an ATS to me, comparing candidates. Here's when I'm hearing more and more this is happening. You're asked to submit them with your application for a job. This is similar in applying to grad school and in fellowships. You do submit references at the time of the application. In jobs, you usually don't, for all the reasons we talked about, including the process is taking a long time. What I'm hearing is the old send a piece of paper by mail or email that had all the information on it in Word or whatever is not happening. Now you're being asked to put them into a database structure. So someone recently said she was given a link and she had to go populate the link and with the information for each reference. Someone else said that it was in the ATS questions, but they didn't remember whether it was part of the questions to get in to submit your application or whether it was at the end. So things are definitely changing, and there's no standard except that now getting them submitted at the time of doing the application is putting more pressure on references just to be ready and more pressure on you who are submitting them. We'll talk about that. So I want to talk about what usually the standard reference requests are, or the people that you want to focus on. Almost everyone I've talked to in the last year especially has said that their job applications are specifying that 2 of the 3 references, it's almost always 3 references, have to be from your last 2 jobs, usually from your supervisor or boss. And then the third one should be someone who knows your work well. How do you select a reference? Let's go through who they could be and who else they might be, or who they probably are. This could be your boss or a supervisor on a team you're working on, even if it's not your direct, even if she or he is not directly your boss of your division, for example. Could be someone in academia, professor, even teaching assistants, postgrads, a variety of ways that academia might help you even in the job setting. Maybe HR, depends how small or big the company is and how well you've worked with HR, but HR certainly could, beyond commenting on the dates you were verified. I worked with HR a lot on hiring and reorganizing divisions, and so that person probably knew me fairly well. Peer mentoring is definitely a thing. You can ask colleagues who know your work well to be a mentor, a reference for you. Think about what we're seeing now, side hustles. Maybe two of you are doing business together and that person can comment on it. The theme throughout all of this is professional, if you want to use that term, but it is, how do you show up with the characteristics of work that we expect from you? So not just the technical content of Sue knows evaluation, but do you show up on time? Are you prepared? Do you meet deadlines? Are your communication skills good? Can you do conflict resolution? And that's why I added this last one here, a mentor or a coach. There are people I have mentored for in long-term programs that I have served as a reference for. I'm very clear about how I know them and what the job that I did with them was, but think about mentoring and other ways that you can understand people's work characteristics. I'd love it if you would put in the chat before I conclude this section, who else could be a reference for you? Say you had two jobs, but they were at small companies and there was no one else to ask. Who else might speak knowledgeably about your work in the last, say, 4 or 5 years? What kinds of either situations have you been in? And I'll give you a hint, nothing's off the table. Everything you put on your resume and long CV probably a person could serve as a reference. Let me get you started with one. Who was your supervisor in an internship? Yes, Alec, exactly. If you do volunteer work regularly, and my definition is once a month for at least 3 months, or 4 hours a week for at least a full month, you could ask the person who manages you, who you coordinate with, definitely. Consultancy work, Sheila, absolutely, definitely. You want to get references, you can from them. Yes, I meant to hide this picture because I didn't straighten it all out. But guess what? Think about people that you may not think about. These are great opportunities. You could be working for a relative or a neighborhood friend. Maybe this guy needed you to take care of something every week for while he was gone for 8 weeks. Could be your neighbor, could be your grandpa's business. Maybe you work in a bodega on the weekends. Definitely show up on time, good customer service. Sokna says, ex-colleague references considered, yes. And we're going to talk about ex-colleagues in a minute because Stephanie gave me a couple questions and that's where we're getting to now. Who and in what way do they have to be actively at work right now? But I love all your ideas because that's what you need. Cast a wide net because you might be surprised that the best person besides your 2 most recent jobs for you to give would be someone where you're volunteering regularly. I'm calling these referee situations. So these are the kinds of people that are going to be asked for it. Your boss or supervisor, if you're leaving and you're leaving voluntarily, especially, make sure as you've given your notice, unless the company makes you leave that same day, meet with your boss or your supervisor and verify, will you be a referee for me? Because I'm going to go out and look for a job. Obviously, you're not going to do this if you're working while looking, or as we talked about, always be looking. Explain and make sure people understand this. Explain that you're going to give them everything organized and let them know when an application or a request might be coming up. Make sure you validate their contact information. Do they want to be contacted at their office phone number, cell number, email, or do they want to use their personal? Most will probably want to use their office or company, but you never know. And in terms of their input, I tried to give you some guidance. This is not written about in any way that I could find on the web. My recommendation is you can use a boss and supervisor up to several years after you've left the job, if indeed you stayed in touch with them. It doesn't mean calling them up every month and saying, "Hi, just want to let you know I'm fine." But maybe you give them a once in a year update, or you've run into them at the grocery store, or you see them at a conference. What happens if your referee, a boss, supervisor, someone from an internship or volunteer work, is retiring or has already retired? If they haven't yet retired, before they retire, ask if they will be a referee when they leave, and check with them if they would be available for at least a year, because you expect to be job searching. Now, if someone's retiring and you trust them, and you're not announcing that you're job searching, you could let them know that you expect to job search and ask them to keep it confidential. Please get their information to contact them, cell phone, email at the very least, before they retire, because they will stop checking their work email. They'll be taken off work email, and you may not be able to get hold of them. So I recommend, if the person's retiring or has retired, about 1 to 2 years after they've left, because they're out of the workforce in some fashion, but also they don't necessarily keep up with the kind of work that you did with them or alongside them, unless it was a job that you had most recently. So what about peer colleagues? Thanks, Sokna, for asking about this. Yes, and I showed you a picture of two women working together. Absolutely, you can use peer colleagues for that third position, for example. But before you even start job searching, just say, "I know, Sokna, we've worked closely together. You have helped me in these ways, and I know that I've been able to help you as well. I'm going to start job searching. I'd like to know if I could call on you as a reference for," and describe the content and the focus that you're asking them that you would want them to bring. But as I started out this section saying, remind them that you will give them everything that they need in an organized way, which leads us to do, what should you do? This is your takeaway. References are not just the other person's work. It's not just saying on a piece of paper, "Oh, I'm going to list Sue and Ron and and Sheila. I'll just put them down." First thing, before you even start your job search, who do you want as your references? Identify who it is, contact information, and why you've chosen them. And everything that you see that I did in Excel today, I've been doing these over the last few months. I'm happy to give you a link to use the framework if it helps you. But write down, how does the person know you, for how long, all of those details. Then once you've done that, prep those referees references before you start searching. So if it's someone you worked with at a previous job, you might email them and say, "Just want to let you know I've been doing this and this. I'm moving on, or I'm starting a job search. I'm now searching to be a senior program manager." Summarize, and I'm going to show you, summarize what you would give them before the application is submitted, and then detail what you'd like from them. Here's what these two bullets mean. Sue, I really welcome using you, Stephanie, as a reference. Before I submit an application, I'll let you know the specific name, title of the job, and at what agency, and would give you more when you're ready for me to send it to you. I'd like to know, I would also detail for you what specifically I need from you or would like you to comment on about my work, because now we are finding, you're going to have, by the way, you're going to have to educate everybody. Now we are finding that applicants are being asked to supply references when they submit a job application. Ask them to confirm whether they can be a reference for you and make it easy to respond. And you might even say in the subject line, checking in on whether you can be a reference. See bottom for one line to respond. And you can just say at the end, "Please just write back to this email saying happy to do it, and my contact information hasn't changed." And I realize I said next screen, but I moved the screen around. So I'll tell you what you're going to give them and how. You're also, if indeed you're having to submit references with the application or at the interview, just email your referees and let them know. It surprised me. Someone asked me to be a referee. I agreed. I didn't get anything from them. And suddenly I get an automated request from the employing company's database or something saying, please submit your reference for Ms. So-and-so here. And I was a little shocked and had to reach out to the person and get the information. So let them know that their name's going in, because remember, every time you submit a reference, it's their name, their degrees, phone number, email. So all of that information's being shared. We want to be careful with it. And when I talk about controlling your reference, I'm not talking about the person. I'm talking about the information that you give to the reference so that you can be glowingly rewarded with a letter that says how great you are. So it needs to be organized, it needs to be succinct, and in the order that is needed. And after the person who didn't tell me she was applying, I went and made a Google form so that I can request all the information I need from you. But what you need to identify is all of these things. Make sure the person knows the deadline, make sure they know how you're supposed to submit it. And you shouldn't be forwarding an email with 5 different attachments saying, here's all the things you'll need to write my reference. Thanks very much, Sue. Give me help. Draft text, you'll see this in number 7. Draft an actual reference letter that describes how you meet the requirements and the specifics. A reference letter similar to a cover letter. Here's what's relevant that Sue did with the job you want her for, not just, oh, Sue's great, I know she knows how to do a t-test. So you want them to help you. Don't make me do your work for you. And I just want to end with issues about a recent job. We talked about that at the beginning with Quora and others saying, if you have an issue with a reference that's not going to give you a glowing reference, then say something about it. I recommended this to someone. I don't know if she ended up doing it, but she had an automated system and she had to put in her recent 2 employers and the supervisor that she had. And I said, it's very easy to make a quick table format. I made this in Excel so that you can list your 2 previous employers, you can verify all the information, and then you can describe the work and the context that you had for leaving and mail it, email, I hope, to HR. So at least you're putting your side of the conversation out there, or as the man from Quora said, be frank and give me what I need and let me decide. So there are a lot of references. A couple of them are just big Google searches that I'll send to you when I send this out. And I'm going to stop there and ask for questions, comments, thoughts, anything you've been through, because all of you have much more experience on job searching than I do. I help you with it, but I don't do it. You can just unmute and start speaking if you want.
Hey Sue, it's Alec.
Hi, Alec.
I have a comment.
Uh-huh.
As someone that does give references as well, quite commonly to like past mentees and people that I've supervised, I've noticed a trend developing, which is that the hiring manager will email me directly. They don't call, they'll email me and they will have either a standard list of questions that they want me to respond to, 1 through 10, usually with increasing levels of detail
Right.
about the applicant, their work, and do I recommend them, yes or no, kind of things. And then the other thing I've seen for more senior positions in particular, because I've also given references for past supervisors, they can come to you as well, interestingly. They'll ask me to write like a paragraph about what I know of their experience with a certain focus area. What is this person's experience working on strategic advisory in said countries? And they want a pretty detailed response. So I'm interested to see that you're collecting this information from mentees because I find that it can be pretty specific depending on what the job is.
I'm encountering the exact same thing. And I end up having to actually ask the person for their full resume because they want that level to detail. I just wanted to chime in on that. I'm glad it's not just me. So thank you for speaking up.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Alex, these are interesting comments and questions, and I'm not surprised. But what I do know is that a lot of times I'm getting requests to be a referee when I don't even know people I haven't heard from in a while. I will determine if I've worked with you recently enough to say yes. But before I even agree, I want to know what is it that you're aiming for and make sure that you have the information I need. In your case, it's interesting what you're saying, because that used to be, in my experience of both looking for jobs occasionally and also hiring people, that used to be much more significant when we were talking to people. We used to have at both companies that I worked at in the US a verbal offer, and that gave time for negotiations, but it also gave time for reference checks to be able to check on, do they really know what I don't know, the faith-based initiative was a big thing when I was at one of the companies. What I find they're doing, though, Alex, is they're asking you, and I have gotten in the past for some senior positions, I've gotten people's requests via the company directly, and they want me to give a lot of detail. And I usually write back to them and say, I know there are time zone issues, but I'd rather talk to you about this in person, because I don't want to spend an hour and a half writing a carefully worded paragraph about everything I know about how Mr. T can do certain things when I don't know what they're doing with that information. I know they're incorporating it. And you said you've done phone references and list of questions and probing questions. Yeah, I find that's where I get asked about, like, the people skills. Are they good communicators, conflict resolution, team dependence? I think the ability to talk about the job performance of someone in terms of their senior work when you're more junior, and I don't mean that you were, but just that there was obviously the way you were describing it made me think, oh, what would I say about my supervisor, who was clearly more experienced than I was in a lot of research? And you just have to comment. But I love knowing this. I'm interested in knowing how you all are being pulled in different directions, because the reason I set the form to get it from people that want me to write a reference for them is I was spending my time chasing people that wanted me to do them a favor, basically. And what I want to prevent you all from is getting referees who don't cooperate. Now, remember, I said at the beginning, several people keep telling me, Sue, my referees never meet the deadlines. It tends to be more academia than business, but it also is business. And I think if you can show people that you're organized and you have this all ready to go, and you can define what it is that you want me to say about it. It's not that I won't write the letter, and I tailor the letters, but I don't want to have to go through all your stuff and try to figure out, since I didn't work for you since the last year and a half, what exactly have you been doing lately? A long way around, Alec, agreeing with you, and also on that as an example, which I'll put into the next time I present this. Thank you for that. Other comments or questions or thoughts on this?
So you mentioned 2 years for people we want to be somebody to do a reference for us. How do you feel about when you've worked with a colleague, but it's been many years ago, long enough that I even hesitated for a moment because it had been way past 2 years? Would you just say to them, I would suggest somebody else? I did a good reference and they had earned it because they had done a good job when I had worked across with them as a peer and in a supervisor position. But I was just thinking about that and wondered your thoughts.
It's a good point. I remind people all the time, our work changes so much even after 2 years, which is why I'm suggesting that. Now, that may be superseded by the previous 2 jobs if you've had one job for 10 years and another job for 10. But I'm sure most people nowadays who are hiring are interested in what have you been doing in the last couple years. That's why I said 2 years, which is where you're at the level of what they're hiring you for to be able to advance. I came across when I retired in 2014, I early retired and had a group of people from my previous employer reaching out to me to ask me to write them LinkedIn recommendations. And for most of them, I had never worked directly with them. I knew of their work, or there were several IT people that wanted me, and the ones that I worked with regularly, I would try to do that. But anybody who reaches out to me after a year and I haven't heard from them, and then the first thing they write back to me is not, oh, I'm so glad I took your course, or I got the great job. It's, can you give me a reference? I'm going to be really careful about that, because I think even in a year, depending on what kind of career you've been having and where you are in your jobs, that makes it difficult for me. I have given references for people 4 and 5 years out, but those were just two people in the last few years, 2 people that I'd worked with for over 2 years in long-term mentoring relationships. So I think that you all are better off agreeing if you feel you can provide value, but I can only envision the letter or whatever, Stephanie, where you say something like, I worked with her in 2010, and that's already 14 years ago. So I don't know what that would say to the hiring manager, but I'm glad it worked out well for her. We always make caveats in our references about at the time that I worked with her, or most recently was 6 months ago, and I was glad to see she was considering grad school or something like that. Does that help?
Yes, that does help. Thank you.
The other question I thought you were going to ask is, because Stephanie works at CDC, you've been there for a long time and you have a lot of connections. So some of what I gave as advice and opportunities today may not work when you're in a setting where you may have changed to a different branch and a different job, but people at meetings, you're collaborating with them, then maybe 5 years is okay. And none of these timelines are written down anywhere. I want you to get the best references you can. And that's why I was trying to put time limits on it. Yeah, Alex says if your old job was focused on a different sector and you want to move to that, then older referees could speak to your prior experience. That's true. That's true. But again, if you want to move back to the sector, I'd still need to know how you've kept up with the previous sector. Maybe you've been big in corporate social responsibility for small and medium-sized enterprises, and then you went more technical into maybe clinical HIV program work, and now you want to go back to CSR. I'd want to know, oh, Alex been part of the technical working group and she goes to webinars every month or whatever. So just something that can speak to how and in what way you've kept up with it, not just, oh, I decide I'll pivot back to this and get someone to write me a reference. And you can tell I'm probably much more direct, and I see a straight line dividing things. There is wiggle room for all of these, but you bring up great points that there's no one way to produce it. And the fact that so much online is already out of date from what you all are experiencing and have told me, I'm glad we can at least talk about it. You all bring these great examples. Any last comments before we close? Thank you again for all the input, for sharing all of your experiences. Ron was away this week, so we'll see him next time. This is so you know you can use any of these materials. I'll send out the recording. I should get it out with the references by tomorrow evening. I'll make this offer to you all. Anybody now or watching the recording, if any of you are being asked about references and need some guidance, let me know. I'll be glad to jump on a call and help you. I will put the links in as well to the tools that I developed in Excel, just because that way you don't have to start from scratch if you're interested.